Once upon a time, I used to call myself a conservative. However, I grew disappointed with that movement and with the people who represent it. Why? Because conservatism has been doing nothing but losing for the past 90 years. This is the reason why I gradually lost my faith in the conservative movement and started looking for alternatives. However, there are many sympathies that I still have with some of them, and this essay is dedicated to one of them in specific. The only conservative that I still watch is John Doyle, because I find his rants to be very entertaining, even if I often disagree with them. However, the opinion where I disagree with him the most is his faith in right-wing populism, and specifically in Trump. This movement might have a lot of energy, but I think that in the end it will fail. In this essay, I will give my reasons for my pessimism, and then I will explain why I think that the left always wins, and finally, we will see what strategy the conservatives could use, but won't use, to actually win one of these days. This essay should not be intended as anything other than a friendly argument addressed to all conservatives who are interested in political strategy. That said, it might still be interesting to people of other political persuasions. I think that the biggest contradiction within John Doyle's channel is that he is a person with a very firm moral compass that has done many videos in favor of traditional morals. However, he still embraces Trump, who does not embody any of them. So we must ask ourselves, how can a person that made a 2-hour-long video against pornography embrace a politician that cheated on his wife with a porn star? Now, I do believe that he is fully aware of this contradiction and about the other shortcomings of Donald Trump. He has dedicated a good percentage of his rants to explaining why he is a Trump supporter. In his own words,
there's a certain conversation that one has to have with themselves before voting for Donald Trump, before accepting the Don into one's heart, which is basically this. I don't care about the Access Hollywood tape. I don't care about the tweets. I don't care about the lack of filter. I actually like them. They're coming for my children. They're erasing my history. They're taking my money. I need somebody who's going to go after these people.
John Doyle is a firm supporter of Donald Trump because he believes that the conservative establishment is useless and that there is nothing that stands in opposition to the progressive establishment other than Donald Trump. And in that sense, I think that he is very much correct. It would seem that right-wing populism is the only true opposition to the status quo in the US, but also in Europe. The only real alternatives are mainstream conservatism and libertarianism. Mainstream conservatism has failed to conserve anything, and it has been an absolute disappointment everywhere, from the Conservative Party in the UK to the CDU in Germany to the Bush administration in the US. While libertarianism is an ideology whose main defect is that it is powerless to fix social problems because they only focus on economic ones. Even if I might partly agree with them economically, I would still think that they cannot do much for the decay of social institutions in Western countries. It is my firm belief that the fuel of right-wing populism is simply the desperation and the lack of alternatives that are more effective and more virtuous. In very many ways, we right-wingers have our backs to the wall. We see that our countries and our societies are decaying, and we want to do something about it. If conservatives see no way of doing something other than embracing populist candidates, then they will do so, and they will try to ignore the less virtuous parts of their personality. John admits that Trump is quote-unquote not perfect, but he is our best shot. Fair enough. Where I disagree with Doyle is in the idea that Trump and the populist right really represent a plausible way to stop the decay of Western countries. Because I do not believe that the populist right generates enough political power to bring about any change. The only way to make political changes is to have political power. Without political power, policy is worthless. So then we must ask ourselves, where does political power come from in our liberal democracies? I think it is fairly obvious to say that power comes from our institutions. The 20th and the 21st centuries have been the centuries of bureaucracy. Before modern times, the state was very weak because communication was very difficult between the different parts of a country. So, the easiest way to have a stable government was to concentrate all the power in one place. This could be a parliament or a king's court. However, due to modern communications technology, the government can be everywhere at once. Therefore, power stopped concentrating itself in a single person and can now be found in faceless organizations with long names and large committees that are run by many little kings. The people working in these organizations are not regular people. Instead, they are bureaucrats. Your average bureaucrat went to university, gets paid an above average salary, and his job is very secure. The job of the bureaucrat depends on the institution and not on the popular perception of this institution. Therefore, bureaucracies are immune to populism. Populism can move millions, but that does not matter to the bureaucrat. He is isolated from all that in his office, and his institution will protect him. Imagine using popular pressure to get a judge fired. It would be practically impossible to do so as long as the Department of Justice defends him and keeps paying his salary from your taxes. Maybe you could even elect a president to fire him, but not even the president has the legal power over the court system. The bureaucrats control the institution. If you do not control the bureaucrats, you have no power here. There we can explain why Trump has had so little success during his 4 years as president, with majorities in the House and Congress, why Boris Johnson was such a massive disappointment, or why so many popular movements have failed like the Yellow Vests or Occupy Wall Street. Populism can move millions of people, but in the end, the only thing that matters is institutional power. The only thing that really matters in modern politics is who controls the bureaucrats. If the right wing wants to win one of these days, we have to staff the institutions with bureaucrats that serve our interests. But first, we need to know which institutions are the ones that actually matter. So our next question will be, inside any liberal democracy, there are 3 groups of bureaucrats that hold power. They work together for the benefit of each other and protect each other from any outside dangers, like, for example, angry peasants with pitchforks. The first group of bureaucrats is the civil service. The civil service is the class of people that staff the ministries and departments of any government building. These are formal structures that hold power that is direct and easy to see, and it is obvious that they are important. The second group of bureaucrats is the press. They technically are not even part of the government, but they hold more direct power than any other group. The press controls the information that the public receives, and by extension, the way that it thinks. When we read that North Koreans believe that Kim Jong-un can literally perform miracles, we tend to smugly scoff at their ignorance. But we are not smarter than North Koreans. And the only reason that we do not believe in Kim's mighty powers is that we do not read it in our own newspapers. If we did read it everywhere, most people would come to believe it. The reason for the great power of the press is that we cannot verify 99% of the things that we are told. For example, I have never been to Boston, and I have never met anyone from there. So the only reason that I assume that Boston exists is that I have been told that it exists. We live in such small worlds in our small lives that we have to trust someone to tell us what is going on beyond what our eyes can see. And this trust can be used and abused to control the way that millions of people think about political and social issues. Of course, in our countries with a free press, technically, any newspaper can be a part of the press. But what I mean by press are the newspapers that are institutionally trusted, enough so that you could use them as a citation. What would your university professor think if you had Fox News as a reference in your essay? I think he wouldn't like that. I think that our hypothetical professor would only trust something that is more reliable, like the New York Times or the BBC. The last group of bureaucrats, but arguably the most important one, is the university faculty. The faculty is made up of professors, experts, and the people who run the educational system. The power of the faculty is not obvious until you realize that they train the next generation of specialists and academics. If you want an influential position in the economy, you have to study. You cannot become an engineer or a lawyer without visiting a university. Therefore, the university holds the power of giving important positions to their students. It selects for the future aristocracy. Practically everyone in a position of power went to university, so the university holds a large amount of leverage over the institutions which they indirectly staff. For example, large companies, specialist positions, but most importantly, the press and the significant positions of the civil service. As a consequence, the ideas that are popular inside a university will also become popular among the most influential people of society. The bureaucrats of the faculty have the power to shape the future of society. These three groups of bureaucrats work with each other to constitute what we would call the status quo. Obviously, the status quo is overwhelmingly progressive. This is fairly clear when we look at the ratio of registered Republicans to Democrats in university faculties, when we look at the statistics of campaign contributions made by civil servants, and when we look at the coverage of Donald Trump made by the press. If the right wing tried to take over or infiltrate one of these three groups, the other two would come to their aid. Imagine trying to take Yale over. The press would go full McCarthy about far-right infiltration, and all the other universities would crack the fuck down on non-progressives. Even if every faculty member in Yale was replaced by a right-winger, you know what would happen to the accreditation? That's right, it would be gone, along with the future of this university. This would make a lot of sense if we were living in East Germany, where there was one party in power that controlled education, the civil service, and the press. However, as hard as we may try, we do not see this. All these organizations agree with each other on progressive issues, but there is no central organization that coordinates all of these independent institutions, and yet they march in lockstep leftwards without exception. Now, this analysis of power structures is not mine. This idea belongs to Curtis Yarvin, and he calls it the Cathedral, in reference that these institutions have the same role as the church in medieval times. The church did not directly rule medieval Europe. However, everybody, including emperors, had to do as they said or face excommunication. In the words of Stalin, the Pope, how many divisions does he have? The press and the faculty are not officially part of the government, but they hold more power than any other department because they control, in one hand, the accepted ideas, and in the other, the future of society. Now, we must ask ourselves, why are these institutions progressive? In my opinion, this is because all these bureaucracies are staffed by people from the same social class, that being the intelligentsia. And so they all have similar values and interests. But what is the intelligentsia? The intelligentsia is the segment of the upper class that defines itself by academic pursuits instead of economic success. Teachers and professors, journalists, literature and art students, social sciences, and overall all university students, with the exceptions of purely technical or administrative positions such as engineers and accountants, which belong to the bourgeoisie. If these bureaucracies are overwhelmingly progressive, they are progressive because progressive ideas resonate with the current intelligentsia. So we have to ask ourselves, why do progressive ideas resonate with the intelligentsia? Simple. Progressive ideas promise two irresistible things: utopia and power. Progressive ideas offer an image of the future where the individual can finally be free from all constraints and oppression. A vision of the endpoint of Whig history where everyone has enough and we can all live happy lives. In my opinion, progressivism also offers power to the aspiring members of the intelligentsia. That is because intellectuals normally look at themselves as being at the top of the social pyramid. For example, someone with a PhD in sociology will consider himself to be more cultured than a banker. But the irony is that the banker is more useful to the economy than the intellectual, and therefore he makes more money. And so the members of the intelligentsia tend to feel that they should be in charge of things, but instead they find themselves with a huge debt and a badly paid job. This leaves a good percentage of the intelligentsia resentful and left out in the cold. So the intelligentsia embraces the ideas that justify them and their institutions taking power. Of course, this would be for the good of the oppressed and not at all for their own benefit. This is not a new trend. Since the 19th century, intellectuals were embracing revolutionary ideas to justify more power to their institutions. Communism was incredibly popular with the intelligentsia in the first half of the 20th century, with writers such as Hemingway, journalists such as Reed, or philosophers like Sartre. But in my opinion, the intelligentsia was using the plight of the workers for their own benefit. The evidence is how the New Left threw the working class under the bus as soon as they were not useful anymore, and began to justify their institutional power in the name of oppressed minorities instead of the working class. If we agree that political power is concentrated in the institutions that are controlled by the intelligentsia, then there are only two possibilities for any right-wing movement that wants to take power. The first option is to remove the intelligentsia from their institutions and take them over. And the second is to seduce the intelligentsia with our evil ideas. The first strategy of takeover is being used by the populist right and is strongly supported by our dear Doyle. However, it is doomed to fail. This idea that Trump, the Fratelli d'Italia, or the AfD will somehow drain the swamp is not going to happen because of the fact that the intelligentsia is much, much stronger than the populist right. The populist right has large amounts of popular support and nothing else. They have no institutional power, while the progressive intelligentsia controls the organs of the state, the educational system, and the established press. The populist right is essentially Banzai charging a machine gun post with a fucking bamboo stick, thinking that if they run fast enough, they will win. The problem is not that the populist right is not popular enough, but other than electoral success, they have no other sources of political power. Whenever the populist right gets elected, it finds itself surrounded by hostile institutions that are immune to their popular support. The press cannot be voted out, the universities cannot be reformed, and the civil service cannot be infiltrated. And even when the right wing manages to win an election, this only strengthens the institutions of the intelligentsia. Candidates like Trump scare them to death. They actually believed that the election of Donald Trump meant that the US would start going full Pinochet. And this is exactly the fear that strengthens them. We see that because of Trump, their institutions became much, much stronger. For example, the New York Times tripled their subscriptions, and the ACLU doubled their donations. But why is the balance of power so lopsided against the right? Because we are living in a world where the left decimated the right wing. Not in 2020, but in 1932. The New Deal destroyed the American old right, and the counterculture killed the rest. Since then, the progressive intelligentsia has had absolute institutional power. If we look at the history of the conservative movement, we realize that it's much younger than the progressive movement. The intelligentsia has been in charge of faculty, the press, and the civil service since the 1930s. Modern progressivism has its roots in the 1950s. while modern right-wing populism is barely 15 years old, 10 in Germany, 12 in France, and 8 in the USA. Therefore, all conservative attempts to achieve political power are going to be fighting an uphill battle that cannot be won with conventional means. There is no way to win that does not also imply a fundamental change to the system, and this will not be easy. It might be a black pill, but I think that it is the realistic situation that all right-wingers have to face. Since dislodging the intelligentsia from their institutions is pretty much impossible under the current circumstances, the only way that the right wing can secure power is to seduce the intelligentsia with their ideas. How can you convince somebody to change political ideas? This is maybe one of the hardest things to do in politics. But what you have to do is first make your opponent lose faith in their own ideas, and then convince them that your ideas are correct in that order. So the most important part of any political strategy that will work for the right wing is to demoralize the progressive intelligentsia. But how can we do this? What does demoralization consist of? Let's take the example of the most successful demoralization in human history, the fall of the Soviet Union. In the beginning of the Soviet Union, the bureaucrats with influential positions, the nomenklatura, believed in their project. However, the people that once believed in the inevitable victory of socialism began to lose their faith during the Soviet stagnation of the 70s and 80s. This is because the nomenklatura knew that it was in charge, and that they were responsible for communism in their country. After 10 years of decay and stagnation, even the most ardent communist must have become disappointed with their own ideology. This is exactly the demoralization that led to the election of Gorbachev and his reforms that ended up killing the Union. The ruling class became successfully demoralized with their own ideology, but this only happened because everybody knew that the party was in charge, and therefore the nation's results were the party's responsibility. However, a system that would be immune to this sort of demoralization would be one where the ruling party had to compete with other parties in elections, but all the important institutions were actually controlled by the party. It would not be obvious that the party held absolute political power, because other political parties would compete for mostly ceremonial positions with them, creating the illusion of choice. In such a system, nobody could believe that the party was directly responsible for the nation's problems. And this is exactly what we have nowadays. Almost all the political power remains in the hands of the intelligentsia, but since there are elections where populist candidates can win, there exists the illusion that the intelligentsia does not hold all the power. In real terms, the election of Donald Trump helped the intelligentsia because it gave them the illusion that they were not in control, and they themselves believed this. The major problems that Western countries face can be traced back to ideas adopted by the intelligentsia, but because they are technically not the only political power, they do not believe that they are responsible for the state of things. The only way to demoralize the intelligentsia is to make it clear that they have absolute political power, and that the state of the nation is their responsibility. This could be done very easily. The right-wing parties would just have to withdraw from presidential and legislative elections. If the Republican Party removed itself from all federal elections and left the Democratic Party with all the power, which they already de facto have, then all the problems that the United States faces will rest de jure on their shoulders. Every time that an election rolls around, all the people that are dissatisfied should go to the polls and enter a blank vote as a sign of disapproval of the current regime. This will demoralize the intelligentsia very effectively. They and their incompetent institutions would have full responsibility for all the problems of the country, while every 2 years an increasing percentage of the population disapproves of them. Meanwhile, the right wing should focus on their communities and keeping them strong and healthy. The contrast between these communities and the porn-addicted, superficial, and infertile rest of society would be all the propaganda that the right wing would ever need. After 4 years of this, 70% of the population could realistically fill in blank votes. And this figure is not unrealistic. In systems where the president has a lot of power, like in France, they also have a very low approval rating. If the progressive intelligentsia would have complete control of formal power, then this rating would also be equally low. I believe that this is the only way that is realistic to demoralize the progressive intelligentsia. Within 10 years, most people would have an unfavorable view of progressivism, and the intelligentsia itself would start to question their own ideas as things get worse and worse. Soon there would be talk of reform, and then the right wing should come in for the kill, the same way that Yeltsin removed Gorbachev when the time was right. The only way to win is to let the progressive intelligentsia discredit itself. Political movements can survive many scandals and setbacks, but not discreditation. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, communism was dead. After World War II, fascism was dead. What we need to do is to put the intelligentsia in a position where they will discredit themselves. I think that the strongest argument for a complete withdrawal from elections would be that things will get worse and worse anyhow, because the right wing is still powerless to stop the decline due to having no institutional power. So I think that the actual difference between open progressive domination and hidden progressive domination is negligible. However, I think that it is indisputable that things have to get worse before they can get better. The important thing is that as things get worse, the intelligentsia should be blamed for it. Although it should be said that the years of complete and open progressive hegemony would not be kind to us right-wingers. I simply see no other alternative. We have to realize that to continue in the current trend entails constant and sure defeat until there is nothing left. John Doyle realizes this. The right wing cannot stay where it is. If the right wing wants to win, there needs to be some change. However, I doubt that increased militancy and populism will get us anything other than more defeat. To ignore the reality of things will not help us. To ignore the machine guns will not make our banzai charge any more effective. We have to realize that the current position of everyone that opposes progressivism is that we are losing. Our situation is dire, and the only thing that we can do is to swallow our pride and think strategically. However, conservative media and politicians live from complaining, getting a lot of donations, and then doing nothing. Most conservatives have no interest in actually acquiring power, because that would mean that they would actually have responsibilities, instead of living a life of complaining about the libs and then feeling smug. The future of the right wing rests on people like John Doyle. The biggest tragedy would be that we would waste our youth, our last shot to stop this decline, in a suicidal frontal attack. If we desire victory, then we have to fight the political equivalent of a guerrilla war. And the first step of a guerrilla campaign is to stop frontal attacks on an enemy who is stronger than you. Instead, we will let victory defeat them. One more thing that I want to remind my viewers is that all of these essays first come out as essays in my Substack, and then I turn them into video essays, which is a difficult and arduous process that takes a lot of time. So if you want to read the stuff when it's fresh, subscribe to my Substack. So yeah, do that.